Hi, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome to the 164th episode of the AfricaMusicLaw.com show. I'm your host, Miss Uduak, and this is also going to be an amazing episode like the previous ones that you've watched or listened to via the podcast. Before I introduce my guest, let me tell you what this platform is all about, how you can subscribe, where you can reach us, etc., etc. So, who are we? We are all about empowering the African artists and the creative industry at large. We are africamusiclaw.com, the africamusiclaw.com show. In addition, in terms of where to find us, go to africamusiclaw.com. Of course, you can subscribe on any major podcast streaming platforms for our podcast. And of course, you can watch us in terms of your live streams on YouTube, and of course, Twitter, Facebook, all the major LinkedIn, all the major social media platforms as well. Now, how do we empower the African artists? Several ways we do this. One of the ways we do is definitely inviting industry experts to come share their expertise and experience to benefit the artists. We, of course, bring talent artists as well on. And in addition, I periodically, the host, Miss Uduak, share certainly legal commentary and analysis on some of the major topics, pop culture, topics in pop culture that collide with the law. So it's always an interesting time. I want to invite you, please, to join us with the comments section or in the comment section and leave your comments. Let me pull that up here so you know to do so. So we've talked about how you can subscribe to the newsletter. Go to africamusiclaw.com to do so. In addition, in terms of your comments throughout when we're interviewing our guest or throughout the show, feel free to leave your comments and we may actually pull it and get a chance to read it to our guest or have her answer any questions you may have. So that is it on the basics and all you need to know. The podcast has been going on since 2014. Last year, we added the live stream. And in addition, in terms of the overall brand, the articles on legal commentary and analysis, we've been going for 10 years now. So it's really exciting to continue in this trajectory. There is someone already leaving comments. Awesome. Let's see who it is. Feridon Bakeshil. Feridon Bakeshil. Excellent. Thank you. Awesome. Joining us from LinkedIn. Good to have you. Thanks for joining us and hope I'm saying your name correctly. So let's talk about our guest. I'll tell you how I met our guest and why I'm so excited about her. Now, within the industry, the fashion entertainment industry is certainly on the African continent. I do describe myself as a visionary, and I am known to be able to so many times predict what is to come next, whether it's as talents, executives, or trends. And I was watching this beautiful woman on a show or YouTube show on her channel. She's actually a host as well on Amplify Africa. Shout out to the folks at Amplify Africa, who I happen to know as well, Timi Adeyeba, as well as Dami Kujembola. So I was watching her and she was great with her hosting. But what was interesting to me was I wasn't paying attention to her guests, who were phenomenal guests, and her work as a host was just amazing. I was paying attention to her and I could not get my mind off her for almost a week. So I reached out to the folks at her particular company, Amplify Africa, and I said, you know what? I have to have her on. There's something unique about her. She's special. I think like you guys just watch because I think she's going to be the next big thing, if not already, when it comes to executive role within the African entertainment industry space and beyond that. She's based out of LA. Who am I talking about? I'm talking about Debbie Alamrew, who is a poet, an author, and a communications expert. It's such a delight to have her. I'm so excited to invite her. So let's bring her in. Debbie, how are
Hi,
you?
I'm good. I'm
Welcome,
good. Thank
welcome,
you.
welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. And oh, what a beautiful intro. It just always gives me the tingles. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Phenomenal woman you are. And I definitely feel like I recognize a phenomenal woman when I see one. I think that you have so much ahead. I'm excited to see where your career goes. and the continued
Thank you.
impact you'll have on the industry based on just the little I've seen so far. But let's pull everyone in. In the meantime, actually, before we do that, there are a couple of things coming in here. Okay, not quite just yet. Some comments, but let's see, on Twitch, on the Twitch platform. Keep it coming. We'll pull you in later. But let's start first with getting to know you. And actually, why don't we just ask how your Sunday is going so far? Thanks for choosing to spend time with us. How's that going?
Thank you. It's going pretty good. It's 1 o'clock over here, so I got up pretty early, did like my kind of regular morning routine, got my cup of coffee, and I've just been chilling and just been really excited to talk to you. So this has made my Sunday.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you so much. So why don't we start from the beginning as we all
Mhm.
collectively, my audience, myself, get to meet you. Who is Debbie Alamrew? How would you describe yourself to someone meeting you for the first time and trying to get to know you?
Wow. Wow, that's deep. Okay, so who is Debbie Alamrew? So, well, to give you a little bit of background, because I think the diverse background that I've had has kind of developed a lot of my strengths. So I was actually born in the UK to two Ethiopian parents, and I spent my childhood growing up in Nigeria. So my father worked for Shell, oil company. So we lived in Nigeria, and then I moved back to the UK at 7. Then I moved by myself to the US. So my parents chose to stay in the UK. I moved. I was very stubborn and very knew what I wanted. I just knew I wanted to live in America. So I moved at 17, went to college in Texas. Um, Culture shock, but I love Texas. I love Texas now, but it was definitely a huge culture shock when I first moved. Um, then after Texas, I went to law school in Maine, and then I moved to LA. And I actually currently live in Brooklyn, New York. So I made the move to New
Wow,
York
you are a
recently.
global citizen.
Yeah, something like that. So I don't know. I think that's kind of a huge part of who I am. That's why I'm able to assimilate in different groups, and I'm able to kind of connect with different cultures and different people.
Very interesting. So why don't we begin to just unpack all of that personal background
Sure.
first, and then we'll get into the career and everything else. So
Okay.
what was causing you or your family to move between Nigeria and Ethiopia in your childhood?
So it was my father's job. I actually never lived in Ethiopia, funnily enough, but it was between London and Nigeria. So my parents, I was born in London, but they were based in Nigeria at the time. So we were back and forth. But they did take me to Ethiopia every single summer growing up. They wanted me to be connected to, my culture, my people, my language. So we would go every summer, never actually lived there, but then we finally settled in the UK. We left Nigeria and settled in the UK when I was 7. And then that was it.
Okay, so what did your father do
He was an
between the
executive at
okay.
Shell Oil Company.
Interesting, interesting. And
Yeah.
your mother, what was her
My mother
background?
was a nurse. Yeah, she
Ah,
was a nurse. She actually did theater in her early sort of, well, I guess like early 20s. She did theater in Ethiopia, and I think that's kind of where I get that sort
yeah,
of
I was gonna say
creative
that.
performance side. But then when she moved to London, she actually pursued nursing.
Okay, so I've been to the UK several times, have some wonderful friends there.
Yeah.
Uh, what was your experience like growing up in the UK? Particularly because you have no accent whatsoever, you British accent, and I literally think of
Yeah,
you as a LA girl despite growing up in Texas.
that's
So,
so funny.
so
No,
what was it like growing up in the UK?
oh, I absolutely loved the UK, and I did have an accent. I unfortunately lost it. I couldn't even tell you when and how, but I loved the UK a lot. I grew up in a very sort of diverse environment, so my friend group was very, I had close Indian friends, close like African friends, close Black friends from Caribbean or from the UK, white friends. It was just very very diverse. So I think that was something I took for granted until I moved to Texas and I saw sort of separations and different, whether it was like college groups, there was the shock of even seeing like the Black Student Association or like fraternities that are white or fraternities that are Black. It's just so like I didn't know what to join when I first came because I was so engulfed in like a diverse community in the UK. But I definitely appreciate growing up that way.
Yeah, that's so interesting that you say that because for folks that may be joining us for the first time, I have said my background is I was born in San Jose, California, Silicon
Mm.
Valley, and I was raised in Nigeria. I relocated back, and I remember the first time I was called a Black girl. I literally was looking
Mm.
around for a Black person because I'd never heard that referred like color referred
Yeah.
to people before. It was so odd to me. I literally looked everywhere until the, the person calling was saying, no, referring to you. I said,
Right.
whoa. Like I literally looked at my skin so I can imagine like black,
Yeah.
where is black? So the cultural shock that you talk about, relocating from the UK, where it was so diverse, and it is quite diverse, all kinds of people. Also, I
Mm.
grew up in Nigeria, a heavy Islam community, so no big
Mm.
deal for me. And when I, visit the UK as well, especially now, it's so saturated with a lot of, the
Oh yeah.
Muslim and Islam influence, no big deal. But
Mm.
then you come to the US,
Mm.
and the representation of all things Middle Eastern or Islam is so
Yeah.
negative. That's also a major culture shock for me because I can't get with the program, especially
Yeah.
with how I grew up and the people that I know that are of that faith or culture. So you relocate to Texas. Why did your family choose Texas of all places? Coming from the UK,
Right.
you guys used to live in London?
So my family didn't choose Texas. My
Okay.
parents chose to stay in the UK. So they chose not to
Oh,
move here. And so my dream was always, when I envisioned it, either New York or LA. But at the time, I had a brother and a sister that were living in Texas. So my parents, this sort of compromise was, if you're going to be stubborn and not let this go and you have to move to the US, then you're going to move and live in a state where we know that you have family close to you. So that was why Texas. My brother was very instrumental in helping me navigate getting my green card and all of that stuff. So that's how I was able to move to the US. So that was why Texas.
okay,
I do
got it.
now I grew to love it. Don't get me wrong. Like Texas has a soft spot in my heart, but being in the deep South, where slavery was it had such a huge impact on people there, and racism is still raging rampant. So that was kind of where the culture shock was for me.
Yeah, Texas is really beautiful, actually. I
Mm.
love Dallas. It's a place I've thought about in future, probably considering even relocating. And
Mm.
there is a very, very strong, depending, I've been to Austin, Dallas, a
Yeah.
couple of other, Houston as well, a couple of other, there's one more place that
San
escapes me right
Antonio?
now. So,
San
yes,
Antonio?
I believe San Antonio, yeah. But I found Houston and Dallas very, very strong. Representation of Africans for sure, Nigerians
Mm.
for
Oh,
sure. I
yeah.
don't know about the
Yeah.
Ethiopian community, but definitely strong
Yeah.
area when it comes to that. Okay, so you are in Texas. What's the transition for you as you're trying to determine what your career goals are going to be and the next
Mm.
move you're going to make?
So it's tough. So growing up, I kind of always wanted to be in like the media creative industry. I wanted to write, I wanted to act, I wanted to make films. And growing up in a very typical African household, that wasn't always sort of like encouraged and pushed. My parents always supported me in my writing, but it was more so like a hobby. So the typical doctor, lawyer, engineer were the choices. When it comes, I'm super squeamish with like blood or anything. So it was very clear early on that Debbie would not be
Nursing,
practicing
yeah.
medicine in any way at all. So I was always good at debating. Like I was always good at like arguing my case, stating the facts. So my dad would jokingly kind of be like, "Oh, this girl's going to be a lawyer," but it always stuck. And so when it came to sort of choosing a career path, that seemed like the most natural one. But in undergrad, I studied English and criminal justice. So that's kind of what led me on the path to then going to law school.
Very, very interesting. So then you go to law school. What
Hmm.
was your hope to become a lawyer? Because it doesn't appear you've been using the
I
degree in that
haven't.
sense. Okay.
Right, right. So, well, I passed the bar, but like the goal was always to do entertainment law. I was always kind of interested in intellectual property, contracts, like that type of stuff. That was always sort of where I was going with it. But like you follow the life's path. Like I always believe, like when God redirects you, you don't sort of fight it. You go to where you're called. And so I've been writing, and I'm currently now like also working in the tech space with an incredible company called Yoni Circle, which basically works to connect women around the world through storytelling. It's an
Mhm.
incredible app. But yeah, so I'm not using my law degree, but it is always there, and it's also
Of
very
course.
useful for the spaces that I work in, to actually know how to read a contract and to
Absolutely.
know the right questions to ask. So walking into situations with that confidence is always great. I don't regret it. You know, life's too short to like regret the things you do. I don't regret going to law school. I'm
Oh,
grateful
no.
for that background, and who
Yeah.
knows what will happen in the future.
Well, going to law school is a very powerful ammunition, if
Mm,
you will, because that
yeah,
degree can open doors and take you places you never even
absolutely.
imagined, whether you happen to be practicing or not. At the end
No,
of the
for
day,
sure.
yeah, JD is definitely a big deal. So, we'll come back to a comment that's been made on LinkedIn very soon. But before we do that, I love that discussion on following the life path, right? So
Mm,
let's talk about you following your life path or pathway, if you will. You
yeah.
decide, okay, I want to go to law school and study law, but there's so much more, Debbie,
Mm,
behind a lot of how you move. And I say that from the
yeah.
limited poetry I've seen you, perform and write and perform. I say that from the limited research I've seen about your kind of work. You bring a lot
Hmm.
of heart. You bring a lot of
Mm,
almost activism in a weird way to what you do. So what informed, yes, your father saying, you know what, you love to debate, you could potentially
yeah.
be a lawyer, but I feel like there's a little bit more about how you approach getting a degree and what you're doing now, still a powerful tool through the media to advocate or get your voice out or that of those that
Mhm.
are not represented. So can you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, well, when it comes to writing, that's always been my strongest, well, from a young age, that was my strongest form of communication. So I was painfully shy as a young girl. Believe it or not, like people that know me now are probably just like, what? But I was really shy. And so how I expressed my feelings and my emotions was always to put pen to paper. And the most natural form that it came out in were these poems. So I would just write like always. I would be up in my room just writing all these poems. I've kept books and journals and binders of all of my poems from the age of 9 up until like the end of high school. Um, but it was always for me. It was never to share. It was never to perform. I didn't even really know about spoken word when I was in high school. It wasn't until I did move to college, and I think I kind of was exposed to what spoken word is, and it just triggered something inside me to want to share my words. And from the first day I stepped foot on a stage in college in Texas, and I saw the reaction that people had, um, I knew that I wanted to do that like always. So
That's
that's
amazing.
really what sparked it for me.
That's amazing. And you know what? We do have something in common. I've been writing poetry for like forever since I was a child
Yeah.
till now. Keep a lot of those poems. Write mostly for myself, although I have been a contributing author
Mhm.
with respect to one of my poems for a book that was distributed internationally. But that brings me actually to your book, right?
Mhm.
Because you're doing all this poetry that you're talking about, and now you find that you have a love for it when you get to college,
Yeah.
open mic, etc., sharing all that wonderful transformational actual pieces. When the few I've
Mhm.
listened to, very powerful. So I noticed though that you connect that bridge between, culturally your heritage as an Ethiopian American or
Mm.
Ethiopian, British, American, Nigerian, right? Just pull
Right.
everything in.
Right.
So I noticed that but you're very big on that. Let's talk about identity, right? So
Mhm.
straddling all these different fences and then or different areas, and then
Yeah.
ultimately coming to the conclusion that you want to lean in more to your East African heritage, your Ethiopian heritage,
Yeah.
and how that translated into your book. So tell us more about sort of discovering that
Mhm.
identity. Yes, you were going back home, but how was that
Yeah.
process?
Yeah.
Unpack it for us.
So, yeah, I think a lot of it, to be honest with you, was when I did kind of lose my accent. I've always identified growing up, I was British. That's what I would say. And then when people leaned in and asked like the second question of like, where are your parents from? That's when I would say Ethiopian, right? So I was always British. Moving here, and then when I kind of started to lose my accent and it wasn't obvious to people where I was from, I would say I'm from London, and then people would be like, oh, but you don't have an accent. And then if I said Texas, it would be, where did you go to high school? But I went to high school in London. So it got really just confusing. So I kind of sat and was like, where do I really call home? And ultimately, for home, home is where my parents are. home is, you know, where my parents' heart is. That's always home for me, regardless of where I live or what I sound like. So my parents are Ethiopian, and like I said earlier, it was
Mm,
important to them to take me to Ethiopia every summer. So I was always connected. I never sort of felt like, oh, I go to Ethiopia and I can't speak the language. I can't talk to my cousins. I can't talk to my grandparents. I always could. So it's easy for me to say, well, I'm Ethiopian, but I live in New York or wherever I am at the time. Um, so in writing my book, you know, I titled it "A Purpose Pursued Passionately is Powerful," and the sort of larger title is Alama, which in Amharic is sort of essentially purpose. So and then if like the cover art is the green, yellow, red. So because I am connected to who I am, I wanted to portray that in my art and in my work. And one of the chapters is legacy, and a big part of my legacy is being Ethiopian, being African, being East African, being Black, being a woman. So all of these things are who I am. So in my work, in all of my creative work, you know, I try to bring as much of who I am as possible.
mm. You know what is interesting that you said home is where my parents are.
Mm,
That's fascinating because we were having a conversation prior to going live about something
mm,
similar, right? And I think for a lot of us, whether Africans, non-Africans that have those dual identities,
mm,
or first generation, second generation immigrant children of immigrants,
yeah,
there is always that long-term view that home is where our parents are.
yeah,
Then at some point we do also, and then there's conflict to some degree on where
mm,
we are, like where exactly is our place. So
right.
can you speak to how you came to that conclusion that home is where your parents are, as opposed to home is where you have grown up, been accepted,
Mhm.
loved, and created your own personal community and reality.
Yeah, I mean, and also just to clarify, like I know I live here in New York, right? So home is America. So any issues that are happening here in America obviously are important to me because that's home, that's where I'm at. So not to say I'm just sort of not considering like the only place that's home is where my parents are, but for me, my parents are my world. They're my everything, right? So it'll always be where they are. That's how I look at it. So I am who I am because of them. And so what made them who they are is where they grew up, who they are, right? So that's why when I look at it, it's like I always want to go home to my parents. That's
Okay.
how I
Okay.
sort of think about it.
Yeah, identity, especially as Afropolitans, right? That
Complicated.
term came a long time ago,
Hmm.
years ago. I think it's over a decade now since the term came out. It can be absolutely complicated. And speaking of
Oh
that
yeah.
complication a little bit more, you defined yourself as Black as well. Once upon a time, it was very rare to find
Mm,
whether African Americans in the sense of Ethiopian, Nigerian, Senegalese, doesn't matter,
mm,
to define themselves as Black, both in the
mm.
diaspora and on the continent. And now it's a global definition of,
Yeah.
you hear everyone saying and embracing that. So let's talk just briefly about trends in that sense. What is
Mm,
your sense of seeing the bridge, especially within the context of entertainment, seeing the bridge between our brothers and sisters on the continent and then in the diaspora,
hmm.
not only coming together on a unified front, but also, locking arms with African Americans or
Yeah.
British, Black people, et cetera, globally. What is your sense, since you're sort of at the center of a lot of that movement as well?
Yeah, I think a lot of it has just been open and transparent and vulnerable conversations. I think there were so many miscommunications, whether it was, you know, African Americans believing that Africans looked down on them and believed that they were better than, or Africans having you know, the wrong ideas of how African Americans are and automatically assuming that they wouldn't be inviting. And so moving to the continent of America and just sort of distancing themselves from them. And a lot of it was just from these like what I think they'll act like, not from actual interactions. So I've noticed just even I've witnessed panels or conversations between people of this current generation, like the younger generation, having these really honest and vulnerable conversations and being like, yeah, I moved to the US from Africa and I thought that African Americans were this way, but actually my experience with them has been this and I was wrong. And, you know, African Americans saying the same thing. So I also think in a large part, sort of music has been a huge part of connecting us. I mean, and I know a lot of Africans say this, but growing up, we've all been called the quote unquote African booty scratcher. We were called all these like derogatory, insulting terms because we were African from the continent. And now it's like, oh my God, I love Afro beats. Like, this is amazing. Like, Wizkid and Burna Boy are you know what I mean? So I think, yeah, the honest conversations, I think has been really a game changer.
Yeah, let's actually continue in that trajectory to talk about all those movements and how it ties into your work as a communications expert. And then I
Mhm.
want to go back to your poetry later on.
Okay.
So, as a communications expert, we're seeing all of these things. You work for Amplify Africa, an events
Hmm.
company at the heart of bringing a lot of this major talents, Burna Boy,
Yeah.
Wizkid, etc. And then liaisoning with, you know, platforms like the Africa Channel, among others, that are bringing
Hmm.
quality content, partnering
Yes.
with them, among others. So, what is your sense of just overall the music trends relating to the continent and the few artists, the few breakout artists, because it's not that much yet, but the few
Yeah.
breakout African artists that are making their presence felt, from the Wizkids that are at the top of the Billboard charts to the
Hmm.
Burna Boys. Your perspective on that?
So, well, as far as with Amplify Africa, like our goal has always been to sort of bridge this gap between the continent and the diaspora. So, to witness these artists, I think a big part of it has been them being authentically themselves. That's what I love the most about these, like the Thames and the Wizkid and Burna and Rema and all of these artists that are really sort of blowing up. Is that they're not being a certain way. They're not assimilating to quote unquote American culture. They are bringing their instrumentals, their sort of inspiration from, artists like Fela Kuti and just like those sort of drums and those beats and their authentic native tongue and whatever it is, but they're bringing that to their music. And that is what people are loving. And I think that is so key in being who you are and allowing people to understand your culture, bringing them in. And I think they're doing it in such a harmonious way that people don't even realize. But I mean, I've witnessed like white people reciting the lyrics of like Burna Boy that aren't English, and it's like, how do you know? Like that's and whatever it is, whether they've just listened to it so many times or they actually went on Google to learn these words, it's naturally and organically like introducing the culture, which I think is beautiful. But to your point, it is very early. It is all only a small fraction. It is really West Africa. It's these Nigerian and Ghanaian artists that are really kind of blowing up. And I know like East African music, a big part of
Mhm.
why it's not blowing up in that way is language, right?
Okay,
Because
very.
English isn't
Mhm,
really spoken as much. And it is like there's a lot of incredible Ethiopian, Eritrean artists that,
mhm.
I could name, but they're speaking in Amharic or in Tigrinya in their native tongue. And that is a little bit more complicated to transition.
Yeah, it's funny that you should say that, because I was gonna go there with you on the East African music side of things.
Yeah.
We did have a panel a while back, some months back, where we had the business of music in Ethiopia. And one of the things I wanted to understand, as someone who's also immersed in the Habesha culture, so the Ethiopian
Hmm.
Eritrean culture, was trying to understand why we weren't seeing more and more of Ethiopian artists from the continent. The panelists that I had
Mm.
happened to be all Ethiopians, not Eritreans yet. Um, so I was trying to understand why we weren't seeing that at the forefront. And that's an interesting point you mentioned about language, which was one. But another
Mm.
thing that was said with the panelists was that there is a lot of pride in not only the
Mm.
language, but the kind of music as well. And so it's like
Mm.
we don't have to compromise, or we don't have to even reach out per se. People need to come more to us, is the mentality for
Mhm.
the most part, because it's such, it's so enclosed in its own enclave and how they do things, which is fascinating to
Mhm.
me, because I would think that there should be more opportunities to join arms with, artists in the
Yeah.
different regions, and then, breach it also with the international front. There was also something that was said about sort of the impact of corruption, if you will, the
Mm.
values, which was so interesting, that was shared as well. But what kind of artists would you say are, or which artists right now would you say we should just be listening to from East Africa, specifically Ethiopia, that you listen to?
Okay. Well, so to go to your previous point, I actually agree in a certain point of like going to the country to experience it, because there's something about being there's something about being immersed in a culture and witnessing how they do everything. So whether it's you go to Ethiopia and you go to, one of these restaurants and where they have like live performers and they have people perform and dance and sing, and it is so authentic because everything around you also is part of that culture. You have, the food, you have the traditions, you have it all there. So I do understand that to a certain degree. Um, and I have noticed this trend, a lot of African Americans and just people from the Western world are traveling a lot more to the continent and experiencing the continent in all its beauty. And I think one thing that always sticks out to me is it's always these like top countries that are represented. So it's like go to Nigeria, to Ghana, to South Africa, and yes, all are
Yeah,
stunning. I
right.
mean, I haven't experienced the continent like I want to, so I'm speaking as myself as well. But there are these countries like Ethiopia, Eritrea, Botswana, Rwanda, Tanzania that are not like talked about as much, but are also so beautiful. So I definitely encourage people to actually go to the continent and experience the continent in its like in all its glory.
Yeah, and I think also that might have a lot to do with the tourism departments of a lot of these
Hmm.
countries, because I know
For sure.
Ghana is like not messing around
Oh
when
yeah,
it
there's
comes
things.
to
Oh yeah,
very actively saying African Americans or whatever
yeah,
you are, come visit Ghana. And they're so, so intentional about it, reaching out to, Ghanaians of celebrities in the US of Ghanaian heritage, among
yep.
others, Nigerians. South Africa is so
Oh
good
yeah,
at country branding, not just of South Africa, but even having other Africans country brand for them, using their
yeah,
celebrities as well, among other things.
yes. Like the
So
year of the return was just
exactly.
huge.
Exactly, exactly. So I think if
Yeah.
we see more African countries, we did have folks from Morocco, for example, on the show talking about the
Oh
business
nice.
of music in that region as well, North Africa as a whole. If we have more and more of those kinds of collaborations, I think we
For
should
sure.
then see more push. So I want to take it back to the tech discussion, and then I'm going to come to the
Hmm.
poetry stuff. And in fact,
Sure.
there is a comment focused on poetry, so we'll get back to that at the tail end. But
Okay.
on the tech side, I loved what you said about the company you're working for with tech and what they're doing
Hmm.
with women.
Hmm.
But before we focus in on women and tech issues, let's stay in within entertainment and tech relating to the African continent. Where are the places you think we should be thinking about and improving
Hmm.
as we continue to see not only in the entertainment space, lots of investments in tech, lots of investment with social media platforms and tech and music? Where are we not necessarily doing things? I don't want to say right. Where are we not necessarily coming to the table with that on our mind, on the forefront of our mind, and where do we need to be improving?
Yeah, I mean, so one thing that came to me straight away when you said social media is how Twitter just had their African hub open, and I think that sort of building our own spaces is what's really important for us right now. A lot of it is sort of dependent, even going to that music thing when you said it's so dependent of African based artists to come to the US and sort of establish themselves here. And of course, the US will always be number one in the sense of like to go back to the age old saying of like if you make it in America, you can make it anywhere. But I think building our own platforms that are strictly for us is really kind of where we're going to be able to take off and elevate and connect though. Like this whole idea of competition is what will always hold us back. And I think there's so much of being like, oh, the top African artist or the top, like the best African something, when in all fairness, there's space for everybody. So I think grouping together, stepping on each other's shoulders, and really kind of creating the space for all of us to be equal and shine our own light, I think is what's going to really elevate us.
Let's explore that a little bit more. Building our own platforms on the continent or in the diaspora. And the reason why I ask is over and over again, we keep
Mm,
seeing not only the lack of infrastructure, that's one thing, but the
right.
lack of coming together with the funding that we can all
Mm,
collectively bring to the table as Africans. That's usually not
yeah.
there. We're not as trustful with each other to do that. will the trust, the foreign direct investments coming in, foreign companies, the conglomerates first
Yep.
before we trust each other. Unfortunately,
Yep.
unfortunately, it just is what it is. So when you talk about building our own platform, should we at this point say, you know what, foreigners are going to come in and build infrastructure and they
Mhm.
have the funding to be able to do that? Maybe we should just focus more on the partnerships and focus more
Mm.
on finding, especially, from both legal backgrounds, focusing more on ensuring that we have the fairest contracts possible
Oh
so that
yeah.
we're not
Mhm.
in the worst situation. What are your thoughts on that particular concern of the
Yeah.
lack of infrastructure, lack of funding, but most importantly, lack of working together cohesively
Yeah.
to advance the continent or the diaspora?
Yes. So yeah, I think the diaspora community, I think one of our goals, our responsibilities should be, whether you're first generation or your country moved here decades ago, we always sort of have this responsibility to Africa, to Mother Africa, right? So it's like when we come here, we learn this knowledge, or we are provided opportunities to be able to make money and to connect with, network with people who are at high spaces. I think it's our responsibility to build for the continent, to create these sort of safe spaces, like you said, to review contracts, to ensure all fairness. Even when African artists come here, I've, just seen there's situations where they come here and it's so much confusion. There's just like, from the language to just the structure that we have here, and then for them to navigate this space and even be on a level playing ground to just be able to succeed like other artists, that are born and raised here or have started their careers here. So I think, yeah, that's definitely the responsibility of the diaspora to create those safe spaces.
Mm-hmm. You know, one thing that comes to mind when you talk about our artists coming here is the
Mm.
fact that a lot of our African diasporan artists have just not been able to break through. It's been so frustrating. I've been like in the
Mm.
space for the past 14 years, more specifically, breaking African artists and also showcasing a lot of African artists in the diaspora. And no matter
Yeah.
what happens, it's so tough to I mean, you have African promoters and non-African promoters bring Africans on the continent here first, give
Mm.
visibility to the music over there first before
Yeah.
we do here, even though the folks
Mm.
here, the artists here that are born here, raised here of African heritage are just as talented, put
Yeah.
out great music, and sometimes they end up being, opening acts, etc., but they just can't
Mm.
they can't seem to
Yeah.
find a breakthrough. What do you think might be driving that? Because I'm always curious about why it's so tough to break an African artist in diaspora, and
Yeah.
instead it's easier for the Whiz Kids and the Burner Boys and everything else.
Well, I mean, I'm not 100% sure, but I do know, like, Wizkid, he's not an overnight success, right? He's been
Mhm.
putting out music on the continent for years and years and built like a solid fan base there before even attempting, he moved to the UK and kind of started to do music there and kind of build a name for himself there before coming here. So I don't know if part of it is establishing yourself there first. I don't know if part of it is like this narrative of, are you not quote unquote as African? Are you not deemed an African artist if you've lived in the US for 15 years? I don't know,
Yeah, yeah. Mhm.
But that's tricky. And I think also part of it is really making space. So it is the responsibility of the Whiz Kids and the Burna Boys and the Thames. And I know that they're still sort of
Yeah, still young,
relatively
trying to figure it
early,
out. Yeah.
100%, but it will be to reach back and to pull other artists up, because I think also having that stamp of approval from your favorite
Mhm.
artist is automatically people will kind of receive them or be more likely to receive them.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's tricky to be an African artist on the diaspora in the diaspora and try to put out music as an
Yeah.
African artist. It gets tricky.
Yeah, there was a major exodus at some point focused on the West African market of a lot of our talents here, from the
Yeah.
Tiwa Savages to the Nato
Hmm.
Seas to a lot of talents that had to go back. Even Burna Boy in the
Yeah.
UK, returning back to Nigeria,
Yep.
establishing themselves there first, and
Hmm.
then coming full circle over a decade later to finally break into
Yeah.
the market here
And
because the
that can't
market was
be,
not. Yeah, exactly.
yeah, that
And,
can't be the best way.
yeah, you've had some artists that never leave there, didn't grow up there. They have backgrounds like you exclusively grew up, here or in the diaspora, and then they
Mhm.
uproot everything and relocate, and they didn't necessarily have success or whatever. It was actually
Yeah.
on the contrary. So it's so interesting. I'm always curious
Yeah.
about that. I look forward to what lies ahead for us collectively to be able to make a difference there. Okay, let's talk about women and tech and what you're doing in that space, and then start to wrap it up with back to your poetry. So what are you
Sure.
doing specifically in the women tech space? It sounds fascinating.
Yeah, so like I said, I joined this company recently called Yoni Circle. So my responsibility there is sort of um, growing it, first of all, because it is a global company. So we have members from 80 plus countries, which is incredible to me. But working on growing that, building out an editorial platform where people can not only share their stories, spoken in the sort of circles that are hosted, but also write their stories and allow women around the world to connect with the story of another woman by reading through the app. So it's an incredible company, honestly. I definitely encourage anyone, if you identify as a woman, to download the app. It's called Yoni, Yoni Circle. But yeah, it was actually founded, Chloe Dremel, the founder, she was actually one of the early employees at Snapchat. So
Oh,
she kind of
okay.
took like what she's learned there and realized that she wanted to build this platform that was inclusive for all women of different ages, races, backgrounds, around the world in different countries to be able to connect with one another. And I think the beauty of this sort of app is that you not only tell your story and find comfort in that, but by hearing the stories of other people, you truly like connect to people in a very vulnerable way. So when you hear people that have been through experiences, whether it's racism or, loss or heartbreak or whatever it may be, you're really allowing yourself to open up your perspective and your understanding of people that have had different experiences from different backgrounds.
So is it like a social audio app like Clubhouse
It's a
or
video. So it's a video
video?
app. And
Mm.
so
Mm.
it's
So how do you use
circles
it?
are so
Mhm.
you join a circle and there's no more than 6 women in a circle. So it's a video and
Mm.
audio so you can see and hear them. And you're led through a brief meditation. You're then given a prompt of what the stories will be. And then everyone is given approximately 3 to 4 minutes to share their story. So you have that
Hmm.
time of meditation to
Interesting.
really kind of figure out the story you're going to share. There's no pressure to share a story. And then it ends with like a witness round. So you can share maybe something that you resonated with from somebody's story, or you can share like maybe a piece that you saw, like a thread in all of the stories, a commonality that was exposed to you.
Mhm.
But yeah, it's really, really powerful.
That's interesting. I do know for sure, especially coming post-pandemic, there's such a need for
Oh
community.
yeah.
And anyone that can
Yes.
tap into community definitely is ahead of it.
Absolutely.
So let's focus in on that communications expertise you're bringing to the table when you mentioned growing the platform, right?
Hmm.
Overall, in terms of just for those, particularly since we're also streaming on LinkedIn, and our particular audience are made up of a lot of executives as well,
Hmm.
and everyone wants to know, especially post the pandemic now, how do you amplify my personal brand? Like, how do I amplify my personal brand? How do I, get my product or service out there as a communications expert that you are working with all these different brands?
Hmm.
What are some of the maybe 2 or 3 top tips you think, whether on a personal branding level or professional communications
Hmm.
business owner level, you should
Yeah.
always think about? What would you say are some of the key things?
So honestly, I think for a personal brand, I found like vulnerability has been such a huge thing because especially with going through the pandemic and it being, I mean, just such a heavy year for all of us to go through. A lot of people were definitely trying to sort of navigate their feelings and what that experience taught them, what it exposed to them, how they've grown through it. And so with a personal brand, just vulnerability and being able to kind of navigate whatever it is, like you said, community is such a huge thing. And community became, I think, for a lot of people, so much more necessary and more obvious after that year that we had in 2020. So vulnerability is a huge thing. This might sound like a silly and obvious one, but honesty is such a key as well. Because I think when people are honest about maybe experiences that they've had or things that they've tried that have failed, or why something is so good, but just really, really being honest. Because I think we've also seen what goes around comes around, and something will be exposed. So you don't want to spend so much time working on your brand and then years down the line it's exposed as like, actually no, she didn't really do this, or he didn't really have this, you know what I mean? So like that's such a
Yeah,
huge thing, and it might sound like a silly and an obvious one, but it really, I think,
it
vulnerability and
happens. Yeah,
honesty.
yeah.
So those are like two top ones for me.
Okay. All right. So vulnerability, honesty, and it sounds like really, really leaning in more to that emotional intelligence side of
Yeah,
things, the
absolutely.
emotional intelligence, leadership type of things that affect the brand,
Absolutely.
affect relationships with how you build the fan base or your customer
Hmm.
base, etc. And both
Absolutely.
on the personal and the business side. Very cool. Awesome. So let's get some comments in that have been coming for you on your work in the poetry side of things, and then we
Mm.
want to get ready to start wrapping it up in that sense. So let me get some comments in here. Faradun, I hope I'm saying your name correctly. He says, I used to write that poetry wears perfume and taste. I'm not sure if poetry actually has a color. By color, I don't mean color of a poet. Like a lady friend of mine recites pink and green poems. I would like you to please correct me if I'm wrong. What is your perspective on that? Whether
I've
poetry has perfume
as a
and wears perfume and taste
well,
and,
first of all, I've never
and
heard
has
that.
color.
I love that. I've never thought of poetry having color, but to me, it's interesting that he said a friend of his writes poems in pink and green, like, and
Yeah.
that's it. But to me, it would be every poem would have a different color. When I'm
Mm.
just automatically thinking of poems I've written, I don't know if I could, as a poet, have a color of my poetry as a whole, or if I could tell you that I've written poems in black and in brown, but I've also written poems in pink and in red. You know what I mean? But that's a really interesting take. I like that.
Yeah, it sure is. It sure is. And then more comments from this particular commenter. Let's see what he has to say. Further comments here is, what a powerful program full of energy and expression. Thank you so much for doing. Thanks for
Mhm.
watching and your comments. And yes, I already said we've got a phenomenal woman in the building, Debbie Alamrew, just chopping it up with us and just sharing so much knowledge. Her background is so interesting. How she's navigating life, what she's doing to make a difference. And I want to come back to that as we get ready to start wrapping this up. And I was so intrigued, particularly with your Nipsey Hussle
Mm,
poem. It was so powerful, so
thank you.
well said, so well written. So just talk to us about, putting those words first, share context for those who have not heard it, and then talk to us about putting that together, and then get more into the projects that you're working on, especially as it relates to that area, because I know that's
Yeah.
like your heartbeat for sure.
Yeah. I mean, Nipsey Hussle is someone who I've looked up to and admired for his music, for his penmanship, for everything that he was doing with the community and sort of building the community, you know what I mean? Everything that he did for his people and his heart. And so I've always looked up to him, always been very connected to his music. So when he passed, that was something that I felt very deeply. And my first instinct when I feel sort of pain or excitement or any sort of any emotion, whether it's positive or negative, is to write. So I immediately sort of just started putting words together, and then I was actually asked to perform a piece at his the LA Candlelight Vigil for him, put on by the Habesha community. So it was put on by Habesha Networks, which is an organization based in LA. And so that was when I sort of started to like fine tune it, because initially I wasn't writing it to be performed. I was just putting my words on paper. So the process for me sort of always looks like me initially just pouring words out, and it doesn't really have structure. And then I
Mm.
go through and if I know I'm going to share it somewhere, or if it's going to be published or performed, I'll go through and like sort of fine tune it. I don't do much. I just kind of make sure the structure makes sense.
That's interesting. Your
Yeah,
process. Mhm.
yeah. So yeah, so with that, I did perform it, and I was actually deeply moved because a girl that I
Mhm.
know told me that his mother ended up hearing it and said that she was touched
Oh,
by it. So that was, I was like beyond
it's
honored
powerful.
that she, yeah. So that was very, that meant a lot to me. Um, but yeah, I do that for, one poem that kind of took off was the my Black Lives Matter 2 poem, and that kind of syncs back to you saying about this activism side. I don't identify as like an
So
activist
yeah, no
poet.
joke, right? We never do.
Yeah,
We're just being
yeah,
ourselves, right?
yeah.
Mhm.
So if you're writing about what you're passionate about, like that was another a piece of mine that I'm proud of. So yeah.
Yeah. It's been such a major shift that I've observed over time. It used to be for children of immigrants in general, because I find that other friends of mine have the same experiences from
Hmm.
different communities, which was, focus on your education, get your
Hmm.
education, work, move on with it, and whatever is happening politically, locally, where you
Hmm.
are, where you live, where you're born, where you're raised, is none of your business.
Hmm.
So, make enough to be able to help those back home on the continent and, be about your business. But there's such a huge shift happening where we're
Yeah.
seeing, you know, folks like us say, no, this is our community too. We need to
Yep.
be active. We need to pour back into the community. And it doesn't stop with just our own immediate African community, it
Oh
extends
yeah.
everywhere. And I
Absolutely.
think I think that's really beautiful because I think for a long time our voices were missing in that space.
Yeah.
And what's interesting too is in different parts of the country, you're also finding that we are becoming a stronger, bigger constituent that people have
Hmm.
to pay attention to and even have to
Yeah.
solicit when it comes to votes and come into election season.
Yeah.
So that's very interesting to observe that transformation and shift. All right, Debbie, let's begin to finally wrap it up by talking about what is next for you. What are you up to? What are you getting into? You've got
Yeah.
poetry going, you've got your writings, you've got your book, you've also
Hmm.
got the communications consultation capacity. It appears that you're doing with these different companies, or is it just
Yeah.
okay?
It's just Afro House is who I do the brand consulting with.
Okay,
But the big thing that I'm working on currently is I'm working on my second poetry book. And I
nice.
think that I published my last one in 2019. So there's been so much growth in me as a person. And from what I'm seeing already in my writing, like I think that there's been growth in my writing too. So I'm really excited. I want this to be a much bigger collection of my poetry. And I want my sort of rollout of this one to be bigger. So I self-published my first book, which was a whole thing in and of itself. But I know that that was sort of dipping my feet in the water, like just getting my feet wet, experiencing being a published author, and that was amazing. But I know that I can do so much more with how many people I reach and how I roll this out. So I definitely want this one to be bigger and better. So I've given myself a goal of having my draft finished by the end of the year.
Oh, that's awesome.
So
That's always a
yeah,
lot of work, but
it's a lot of
definitely
work.
worth it. Yeah,
A
definitely
hundred
worth
percent.
it. Yeah. So the
Yeah.
first book, I know you have it segmented into certain categories. Can you tell
Mhm.
our audience a little bit about that and then sort of give us an idea whether the new project, your new book is going to be
Mhm.
in that within that framework or something entirely different?
Yeah, so the chapters I chose for my first book are legacy, love, loss, and liberation.
Mhm.
So anybody that knows my writing, I love alliteration, but also like those four themes at the time I was writing, and possibly throughout my whole life. But those four themes are extremely prevalent and just very, very much who I am. So legacy being this familiar background, identifying as African, Ethiopian, all of those things. Love is love of self, love of family, love experience with a significant other. Loss is sort of touching on loss, losing my sister,
Mm.
the loss of Black lives, and just sort of a lot more loss of just loss of a loved one, whether it's a breakup or and then liberation is, I think, my favorite chapter because it's really coming into my own, rediscovering my relationship with God, my faith, feeling free as a person. So releasing sort of trauma and guilt and pain,
Mm, mm,
heartbreak,
mm.
all of those things, and
Mhm,
just being free. So I think
mhm.
with this next book, it's I don't want to sort of go through all those again, but instead it's exploring different emotions within myself. So as far as how I'm separating the chapters, it won't quite be the same. It'll be a little bit different, but I think it'll be me. Like it'll be the same in that sense, but we've
Yeah.
grown a bit. So
So let's talk about the first book then, just
Mhm.
a little bit more. Oh gosh, so interesting. I've not had an opportunity to read it yet, but I will.
Okay.
But I'm just very fascinated with you and wanted to get you on first. So happy that you were
Thank
able to
you.
join us.
Thank
But
you.
that last part of liberation,
Mm,
to go through, love the legacy, of course, because
mm,
it's very purpose driven. What are we here on earth to do if we're not
yeah.
ultimately focused on the goal of leaving legacy? And legacy could be through your
Mm,
lineage, or it could just be the work you leave behind that has such an impact and transform lives and continues to give back. So there's that part. I love that, right?
mm,
Of course, love, as you talk about, lust is so,
mhm,
or lost is so interesting, and then
mm,
liberation. And I just want to focus on that last two, because losing a sibling,
mhm,
or losing anyone, period, but certainly family member is can be and is very painful. So
mhm.
how do you transition from that to liberation and finding self and working through all that trauma? Like, what was that particular process
Ooh.
and that last part?
It takes time for sure. I think, losing my sister was hard because I was living in LA at the time. So I didn't have any immediate family around me. So hearing that news, I was sort of alone. And though I would, talk to my parents and other sisters and try to process that again, like I've said multiple times throughout this interview, it's when I feel an emotion like that, it's to write is my first sort of instinct. And I don't think you never get over something like that. I don't think that's ever the goal, to get over it. But, one thing that was incredibly instrumental in like my healing process was I wrote a poem for my sister that I was
Mm,
able to perform in Ethiopia last year with my parents in the
mm,
audience. And it was
mhm.
also their first time hearing me live or
Hearing
watching
it.
me live, watching
Mm,
me perform anything live. They've seen videos,
wow.
but actually being
Mhm.
in a space and watching me was when I performed that. So that was really, really big for me. But I think how you move from loss to liberation is just how you do in life. I think my art is a reflection of what my life looks like. Is you get to a point where, again, like I said, I was growing in my faith and growing in my relationship with God, and that brings a lot of understanding and a lot of comfort. And so again, you never forget, you never get over, but you learn to live with your new reality. You learn to live as this new person that you are, and that is what's freeing.
Yeah, so interesting, because usually when people suffer a major loss like that, they question God and wonder, and
Oh
sometimes,
yeah.
many times, people even walk away from a
Mm.
relationship with God. So it's interesting to hear you say you were growing with your relationship with God. That's
Yeah.
fascinating.
And don't get me wrong, you definitely go through the question God like
Mhm.
part. I don't think it's you have to be extremely strong in your faith to not when it happens to you. I definitely did go through that, just to be clear. But when you come through it, you come through stronger.
Awesome, awesome. Debbie Alamrew, what does Alamrew mean?
Oh, I don't know. I don't think Alamrew.
Wait,
I don't
you
think
have
it
to
means
ask your parents so we can find
okay.
out.
I
And the
don't know
full
that
name,
it's
go ahead.
I don't think it's one of those like words that actually has I mean, I can ask, but
Yeah,
Alamrew.
yeah. Most African names I've ever run into have
That's
some
true.
sort of meaning.
That's
So,
true.
and the full name, is it Deborah and then you say Debbie, or actually
No,
Debbie?
it's debris too.
Debris too? Okay.
Hmm.
Do you know the
Yeah.
meaning of that?
It means like spring. From I remember like my parents saying that to me when I was younger.
Okay. Well, you definitely give us a lot of spring with your smile, with your
Oh,
radiance inside and outside, with
thank
all that
you.
you're doing. And it's just such a delight to have you. I know the best is yet to
Thank you.
come.
Thank you
You're
so
very,
much.
very captivating. And I personally am excited to see what the future holds for you.
Thank
And
you so
I'm
much.
glad that you're painting the world a lot more positive, leaving it better than you found it. And ultimately, at the end of the day, that's the least we can do with the talents you've
Mm.
been given on this earth. So good to have you. Thank you so much for
Uh,
coming.
Thank
Where
you
can
so
our
much for
audience
having
reach
me.
you? Let me ensure that I put it here. So where can people find you if they want to follow your
Yeah,
healing here
you
earlier?
can
What
you
is
can
it?
find me on Instagram. It's just at Debbie Alamrew. So my first name, last name, That's
Okay,
it.
at Debbie Alamrew. What about your
Yes.
website, Debbie? You don't want your website
Yes.
so they can always
So
find you, whether Instagram decides to
true.
do something else?
You're right. So you can definitely find my website at www.debbiethewriter.com.
Okay, so
So
this
first
is
name,
Debbie
the writer.
Alamrew.
Yep,
Okay,
that's right.
and then the other one is what?
www.debbiethewriter.com.
Debbie the
I'm
writer.
I'm currently revamping the website, but it's there. It's not like
Yeah,
it's
that's
there.
that's the
So,
central hub. No matter what, you can
yeah,
always find her, even if Instagram decides to do something else. DebbieTheWriter.com.
absolutely. That's
That's it?
correct.
Okay, awesome. So please, if you could just wait in the waiting room, I'm gonna take you off and have you wait in the waiting room just so we can
Absolutely.
speak very briefly, and then let me just close it out with my audience. Thank you so much again for coming.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, everyone. So I hope you enjoyed meeting this remarkable woman who I said, I have to meet. Who is this woman? Debbie Alamrew, just amazing. And we've gotten a chance to really, really unpack her background, who she is, her trajectory going from, you know, UK, Nigeria, back and forth, and then relocating, making the decision to relocate to the US, Texas first, then pursuing a law degree, but then deciding to more focus on her communications work as well as being a poet, and which is a first love and big area that she's focused on, writing her book, all kinds of things, and straddling the two worlds of being, the daughter of an African or African immigrants, and at the same time, finding her place so well as it seems in the world and the impact she's making. So I hope you enjoyed meeting her. I certainly enjoyed meeting her, and I look forward, like I told her, to what the future holds for her. Join us next week for another episode of the AfricanMusicLaw.com show. For listeners, this will be available starting next week for you to listen also via podcast and all our major streaming podcast platforms. And of course, don't forget to sign up for our newsletter at africanmusiclaw.com and go there for quality articles, live streams, and our podcast as a whole. All right, cheers. We will see you next week. Let's get this final thing going.